Boldwood presents The Night Shift, written by Gemma Rogers and read by Imogen Church. For all the Type 1 warriors, may your highs be greater than your lows. In May 2024, just before I started writing this book, my youngest daughter was diagnosed with Type 1 diabetes. It has been a tumultuous few months of learning and navigating new routines. However, I am constantly in awe of her strength and resilience in the face of something that has ultimately been life-changing. I couldn't be prouder. She is my Nina. Chapter 1. Friday, 7th of March, 2025. 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. "You're late, Nina!" Stacey snapped, her voice muffled through the class. She stood with her arms crossed, glaring at me, neck mottled, as I tried to unlock the door, inputting the wrong code into the keypad twice. At 6 o'clock, when my 12-hour shift started at Storage Queen, the 24-hour accessible storage warehouse, the entrance switched from opening by sensor on approach to being locked. After that time, the warehouse was accessed by entering a 6-digit code into the keypad outside. My job was on reception, 3 nights a week, caretaking, basically, and making sure visitors signed in. The unsociable hours paid well, and the solitude was perfect, giving me a quiet place I needed to study for my medical degree. I squeezed through the tiny gap as the entrance slid open at a snail's pace into the modern reception of the warehouse. My nose was red, eyes puffy from crying, but thankfully my boss hadn't noticed, or if she had, she was too infuriated to comment. Her lined face resembled a battered cushion with half its stuffing missing, muscles no longer strong enough to lift her jowls into a proper scowl. Not that I could blame her for being disgruntled when she was waiting to go home. I know, I said, swinging my bag onto the tall yellow gloss counter with a thump, not wanting to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, my car wouldn't start." It was a lie. My beat-up 2007 Ford Focus was as reliable as ever, but I couldn't tell my unsympathetic manager about the row I'd had with my now ex-boyfriend Dom. She wouldn't care that, despite being heartbroken and crying off all my mascara, I'd still hauled my arse to work when I could have called in sick. I had thought about it, pulling the duvet over my head and weeping into it all night. But being a relatively new employee, still on probation, if I didn't work, I didn't get paid. "If you're late, then I'm leaving," she moaned, gathering her bag and keys, eager to get home. I rolled my eyes when she wasn't looking. It was 10 bloody minutes. But I understood. 12-hour shifts sucked. But she was the manager and earned way more than I did, enough to drive a brand new 3 Series BMW. Her lackluster camel-coloured coat, almost the same shade as her wayward hair, was already on, and I waited for her to waddle around the counter and give me what little handover there was. "There's a couple on the 2nd floor in Unit 247 arrived about half an hour ago. They're unloading from a trolley up there. Other than that, it's empty. I did the last check at 5 and we've had no calls either. Should be a quiet night." I nodded, hoping so, waiting for her to leave so I could have a meltdown in private. I had university work to finish and was counting on being undisturbed. That's if I could concentrate on anything at all after breaking up with Dom. I unpacked a sugar-free Red Bull and leftover macaroni cheese from my bag onto the desk to keep me going, and looked up, surprised to find Stacey still standing there. "I've stocked up the snack drawer." Her voice softened, as she glanced first at my food, and then the small, continuous glucose monitor attached to my upper arm, about the size of a 10-pence piece, its rim poking out beneath the sleeve of the purple Storage Queen t-shirt. Along with the optional fleece, the t-shirt was the only uniform we were contracted to wear, so I was able to throw my slouchy jeans on without anyone batting an eyelid. Something I was happy about, as I lived in denim and comfy trainers. "Thanks," I replied, cheeks flushing. Stacey could be a grumpy cow at times, and I guessed by her age that, like my mum, she was probably going through the menopause. She was a stickler for the rules, but on the whole, Stacey wasn't a bad boss when you delved beneath the layers. The snack drawer was always filled with crisps and pot noodles for the night workers, but a few weeks after I'd joined, packs of chewy sweets and fun-sized chocolate bars had appeared in a transparent plastic box with my name on it. Purchased by Stacey specifically for the diabetic employee and woebetied anyone else who had a sugar craving in the middle of the night, as Carl, another night shift worker, had found out after nabbing a tiny Snickers bar. He didn't hear the end of it. "Have a nice evening, and sorry again for being late," I said as cheerily as I could manage. She smiled, her lips pressed into thin lines, and moved past me, punching our staff code, 461822, into the keypad just by the door. "Call if you need me," she mumbled, waving her hand in the air as she exited into the car park, not looking back. I'd never called her, not even on my very first night shift, which had been a baptism of fire. A squirrel had got in through one of the air vents somehow and had set off lights that operated on sensor during the night shift, scurrying around each floor trying to find its way out again. I didn't know what it was at first, convinced the place was haunted or another member of staff was playing a trick on me, like a Storage Queen night shift initiation I knew nothing about. That was until I saw the rodent whipping down one of the corridors at lightning speed, its tail flapping. It took a certain amount of mettle to work nights. Not only tricking your body clock into staying alert during the witching hour, but also braving the solitude. Silence could be overwhelming when you weren't used to it, but I loved my own company, and the majority of customers who wanted access to their storage units in the evening were out the door by 10 o'clock, despite us being open 24 hours a day. Most nights I had around 8 whole hours of peace and quiet to study, other than the regular checks. The first time I had to do a walk-around, which involved checking no one was on site that shouldn't be and all the units were closed and locked, I broke out into a cold sweat. The corridors were long with high ceilings, painted a pale grey with each unit having its own bright yellow metal door. The units ran the length of each corridor on both sides in a U-shape with a staircase at either end, as well as a lift at the west stairwell. When I'd had a tour during my interview 3 months ago, it had reminded me of the inside of a prison from what I'd seen on television, but nothing could prepare me for what it was like after dark. To say it was eerie was an understatement. The fluorescent lights were powered by motion sensors, and I was forever terrified of being plunged into darkness halfway down a corridor. So much so, I always walked with the torch on my phone permanently switched on whenever I was alone. It got so quiet inside the massive building you could hear a pin drop. Nothing but the sound of your own footsteps slapping along the concrete walkway and the thud of your heartbeat. With 3 floors to cover, the checks took around 20 minutes, and that first night I was a nervous wreck, screaming to high heaven when the squirrel I'd seen on the camera darted out in front of me on the first floor. In my interview, Stacey had assured me I'd be quite safe working alone during the night shift. The warehouse was tucked away at the back of an industrial estate in Crawley where I lived, the only lit building after 7 o'clock at night. Its plot included a small car park of 20 spaces covered by cameras, as was inside. Employees used one key code for access after hours, and there were only 5 of us working at Storage Queen, 4 employees and Stacey, the manager, who was on call 24/7 if there were any emergencies. In addition, there was also a panic button installed under the desk in reception that alerted a security firm who would attend the site if pressed. Each entrance and exit using the keypad was logged on the system, and storage renters were given their own unique key code should they wish to access their unit between 6 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning. Everyone who came through the door had to sign in and put down the number plate of the vehicle they were using. During the day shift, when I'd been shown around, the place was a hive of activity. Customers moving house and packing things away into their units or emptying them, dragging trolleys with precariously balanced boxes out to their cars or vans. It amazed me how many people rented storage, and for all kinds of purposes I hadn't considered before joining Storage Queen. Businesses rented units because they didn't have enough office space or for archiving paperwork. The general public stored furniture from downsizing or between house moves, and entrepreneurs filled their spaces with stock ready to sell. The place was a treasure trove, although we rarely got to see inside the units unless we were called upon to assist, which had only happened once since I'd started. Hoping Stacey would be right and the night would be quiet, I put the energy drink and macaroni cheese in the fridge behind my desk and settled into the cushioned chair Stacey had petitioned the owners for. Waking up the mouse, I logged onto the company desktop computer and opened my email. Stacey's radio played in the background, smooth FM on low to populate the silence, and Coldplay's Shiver soothed my fractious mind, which was still replaying my last conversation with Dom. We'd ended our 7-month relationship barely half an hour ago, and I'd like to say it was amicable, but rather we'd got to an impasse. He was going travelling around Thailand in 3 weeks with a friend, Drexel, from years back, someone I was yet to be introduced to. It was a trip that had been planned for ages, and he'd told me he could be away for 6 months. When things began to get serious between us, he'd invited me to join them. But I was just coming to the end of my 2nd year of a 5-year BSMS Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery degree at the University of Brighton, and wasn't prepared to miss any of my course. What followed was a lot of arguments about the future of our relationship. We were poles apart. Dom was hedonistic and had studied agriculture at Plumpton College, where he became friends with the guy he was going travelling with. He dropped out while I was still doing my A-levels and had secured a job as a gardener for an oil exploration company at Gatwick, long before we'd met at a nightclub in Crawley. When he'd approached them for a 6-month sabbatical, they'd agreed, but I didn't have that luxury. I'd worked hard to save the university fees, after thankfully acing my A-levels, and had to save up before I could apply, doing whatever job the agency would throw at me. It was why I'd started the degree later than some. The first year alone had cost over $9,000, and I was lucky to still be living cheaply with my mum. The job at Storage Warehouse would pay for the following year's tuition, and I couldn't jeopardise that no matter how enticing the trip sounded. Dom loved to have a good time, but his values were centred around the environment and reducing the damage humans were doing to the planet. I was a woman of science, an academic determined to become a doctor specialising in diabetes, something that had been part of me since I was diagnosed 8 years ago, aged 13. I didn't want to waste time travelling when I could be helping people with their life-changing illness. Plus, I'd finally found a well-paid job that didn't interfere with my studies. I guessed opposites attract, because despite our differences, I was smitten. And I'd even offered to fly out and visit during the summer break, but for Dom, that hadn't been enough. He'd wanted me to join him for the entire trip. Last one! A voice called from the entrance before an empty trolley crashed into the reinforced glass door. I winced and stood up, peering over the counter. Shit, I'm sorry, a man said, readjusting his hold and offering me a weak smile before frowning at the door, asking the silent question of why it hadn't opened. He was of slim build and handsome, with a ruddy complexion, but his eyes were slightly too far apart. Speckles of grey at the temples of his closely shaved head contradicted his youthful face. It's okay, happens all the time. You need to input your code after 6 o'clock to enter and exit the building. The doors lock automatically overnight. Oh, okay, he replied, nodding his head. Where did the other lady go? There was a shift changeover. She's gone home. He nodded again, and I watched as he fished his phone out of his combat trousers, tapping at the screen to find his code. Something which would have been emailed to him once his rental agreement had been signed and a minimal deposit paid. A second later, he entered it on the keypad to the left of the door, and it slid open. The wheel of the trolley squeaked as he pushed it through to his van outside and began loading it with boxes as the door drew to a close. I shivered. Although it was March and spring was supposed to be in the air, the temperature hadn't got the memo, and I was grateful Storage Queen still had their heating on in reception. Outside in the car park, the floodlights were glowing, illuminating the already dark ombre sky. One flickered ominously, and I returned my attention to the computer to check the cameras, switching between them to survey each floor. The man's wife or girlfriend was nowhere to be seen, but Unit 247 had the door wedged open, so I guessed she was inside, organising the stacking. The first and third floors were quiet. The images on screen were monochrome as the cameras switched to infrared in the darkness, indicating no one was up there. The beep of the keypad pulled my focus back to the door, and the man entered with his trolley now full of boxes, secured together with blue rope. Are you, here all alone at night? There was something about his tone, not just the question, that sent the hairs on the back of my neck standing upright. My mouth went dry. You could get up to anything in here, he added with a chuckle, running his tongue across his lips. He pushed his trolley over to the lift and pressed the button, waiting for the doors to open. When they did, he looked back at me over his shoulder. You let me know if you want some company, eh? He winked before pushing his trolley inside, not taking his eyes off me until the doors drew to a close. Chapter 2. I shuddered in my chair, annoyed at my vulnerability. It unsettled me, being a lone female where random men could intimidate or harass me for fun if they chose to. I was sure that guy was harmless. He was here with his partner after all, and probably just flirting or trying to have a bit of banter with the girl on reception. But I never forgot how susceptible I was working here by myself. It wasn't as if I hadn't felt safe since I'd started working at Storage Queen. Nothing had happened so far. I'd had no strange visitors other than the squirrel, who'd been just as terrified as I was. But I wasn't about to advertise the fact I was alone. Carl had told me once, during his shift, he'd had a man try to gain access in the middle of the night, shouting through the glass and pretending to have forgotten his code. But the policy was we didn't open the doors for anyone except security or the emergency services. If someone had misplaced their code to get in, then they had to come back during the day. All previous codes provided to renters were deleted from the system as soon as their agreement was up, too, so only existing customers could come and go. I was sure it would happen to me at some point. I'd get a weirdo knocking on the glass, but knowing we had the panic button and cameras made me feel safer. Turning my attention back to the monitor, through the camera I watched the creepy man and his lycra-clad partner lifting boxes from the trolley and carrying them inside their storage unit. He paused to give her backside a squeeze, and she slapped his hand away unimpressed. Perhaps they were splitting up, storing items from the house they'd have to sell, or maybe she was just fed up being manhandled. I enjoyed coming up with stories for the renters and what could be inside their units to pass the time. The one they rented was one of our smaller sizes, about the dimensions of a large bathroom, so I imagined it was full to the brim by now. My viewing was interrupted by my phone vibrating with what I initially assumed was a message from Dom. His final words to me just over an hour ago of, "Well, I guess that's it then," as he traipsed back towards his car, still ringing in my ears. My heart had shattered watching him drive away. It wasn't supposed to end like that. I'd hoped we'd make it to the emotional goodbye at the airport, our foreheads touching as we held hands, eyes misty with tears. I'd wanted to wish him well, tell him to take care and be safe in Thailand, content knowing neither of us were going to make any promises for what would happen when he returned. But he'd kept pushing me to book my ticket, refusing to understand why I wouldn't defer for a year. He couldn't comprehend how my desire to become a doctor could stand in the way of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But the vibrating of my phone wasn't a message from Dom. It was my continuous glucose monitoring app, signalling my blood sugar level was 3.9 and action was needed. Every 5 minutes, the monitor attached to my upper arm automatically checked my blood sugar levels via a tiny cannula inserted into the skin, alerting me if I was below 4.0 or higher than 10. I hadn't had a chance to eat before work because I'd been arguing with Dom, plus stress always sent my blood sugars plummeting. I reached for the drawer and pulled a packet of gummies out of the labelled plastic box, chewing rhythmically but barely tasting anything. My stomach was tightly knotted, and I wasn't in the mood for food, hating having to eat when I wasn't hungry, but that was the life of a diabetic. When I glanced back to the camera, the couple were gone, their yellow door now closed and secured with a padlock. Seconds later, the lift chimed and they both emerged, empty trolley in tow. "Thanks. Should we just leave this here?" the man asked, pointing to the neatly stacked collection of trolleys in the corner. He sounded completely normal now the woman was with him, and I guess he'd just been chancing his arm earlier. "Yes, please." He pushed theirs into the stack, and I made a mental note to oil that wheel later because the squeak set my teeth on edge. "Could you sign out, please?" I asked, tapping the open book on the counter. He came over and squiggled his signature, entering the time, giving me another wink before joining his partner by the door. He entered their code, letting the frigid air in again, holding hands all the way to their van, reminding me of everything I'd lost tonight. I sighed, rubbing my puffy eyes, and threw the empty sweet wrapper into the bin. At least I was alone to wallow in self-pity, to try to come to terms with the fact my relationship was over. It wasn't something I wanted to accept, but Dom had made me choose between him and the dream of becoming a doctor I'd been pursuing since I was 13. Now 21, my goal hadn't changed. I'd worked hard and made sacrifices to earn the grades needed to get into university, and as much as I loved Dom, it was no contest. But breaking up still hurt like hell. I swiped away angry tears, wishing I could call my best friend Laura again, like I had on the drive over here, or even Mum, who would at least offer me some words of wisdom. But they were both working tonight, Laura waitressing and Mum at the hospital. The urge to scroll through my phone watching TikToks for hours to go down that wormhole of mindlessness was calling, but instead I begrudgingly pulled my textbook and pad out of my bag, making a start on the work I'd been set at today's lecture on the human airway. If I wasn't going to Thailand to save my relationship, I needed to make damn sure I got my bachelor's degree so my broken heart wouldn't be for nothing. After what seemed like a long, dark and dreary winter, I really could do with some sun. But there was no way I could justify jetting off before I had completed my second year. I turned the radio off, unable to bear another Ed Sheeran love song, and was fully engrossed in labelling a diagram of the respiratory system when headlights swung around the glass front of the building, catching my eye. A VW Golf pulled into the space next to my Focus, and a man in a black baseball cap got out and opened his boot. It was dark, and I squinted to see better in the flickering streetlight, chewing the end of my pen. Through the gloom, I could tell the man was short, around 5'7", and thick-set. He had a huge neck and those rounded, ball-like shoulders from hours spent lifting weights in the gym. I watched as he retrieved a large suitcase, finally turning to face the entrance, allowing me a better view. Despite his stocky appearance, the luggage appeared cumbersome, but luckily for him, it had wheels, and he dragged it towards the glass doors. Whatever was inside was really heavy. I could tell by the way he was leveraging his weight as he walked, leaning forwards onto the balls of his feet. Perhaps it was dumbbells or a whole load of steroids and keratin powder for bodybuilding. I giggled to myself at my assumption. When he reached the doors, he entered the key code without pausing to look it up, and I pulled my features into a welcoming expression. Studying wasn't the only reason I chose the night shifts. I wasn't great with people. I'd be that person at a party in the corner, avoiding eye contact and hoping no one spoke to me. I guess you could say I was guarded, and it didn't always make me the most approachable, although if I was going to be a doctor, it was a skill I'd have to learn. Fake it until you make it. "Hi," I said as brightly as I could manage, standing up to greet him, but the man just nodded in my general direction. He was dressed like he could have come straight from work, in a plain black long-sleeved t-shirt, dark indigo jeans and faded tan work boots. Barely giving me a second glance, he headed directly towards the lift, pulling his cap down as he went. It clearly wasn't his first time at Storage Queen, and he waited with his back towards me, looking down at his phone. Could you sign in, please?" He looked over and frowned before leaving his suitcase by the lift and coming over to the reception desk, scribbling in the book and dropping the pen on the counter. "Have a great night," I muttered under my breath as he returned to the lift, sinking back into my seat. I was going to offer him the use of a trolley, but he obviously didn't want to be bothered. Checking the time, I found I'd been studying for about 40 minutes, actively forcing all thoughts of Dom from my mind. It was only 7:30. The first hour and a half had gone quickly, yet it was easy to clock watch on a night shift where the minutes seemed to tick by slower than usual. When I looked up again, my new visitor had disappeared, but the rumble of the lift sounded as it made its way up the shaft. I flicked through the cameras, wanting to see what floor he'd come out on, and found him on the third, dragging his case, still with some difficulty, right to the end of the corridor before the bend. I remembered asking Stacey during one of our joint shifts where she was training me on the job, whether she ever had the urge to see what people stored. For all we knew, it could be contraband, guns, drugs, or stolen goods. The thought excited me. The idea of the police raiding the building during one of my night shifts, like in a television drama, SWAT teams with guns or hazmat suits swarming every floor, cordoning sections off behind spirals of tape. They have to sign as part of the rental agreement. Nothing that's deemed illegal is allowed to be stored on the premises, was the stock answer she gave me, and I knew then she had no interest. But I burned with desire to peek behind every single yellow door. Mum and I spent hours curled up on the sofa binge-watching the show where people bid on old or discarded storage units for their contents, hoping to find treasure and turn a profit. Some of them made a fortune. Others weren't so lucky. The stocky man in the baseball cap had disappeared from the screen, and I couldn't tell if any of the doors were open at the far end of the corridor. The camera wasn't sharp enough. I never felt totally relaxed unless I was the only one inside the giant warehouse, but tried to go back to my diagram regardless. At least the gummy sweets were raising my blood sugar and would tide me over until I reheated the macaroni cheese, although the thought of it right now curdled my stomach. I knew I had to do my checks, but at the same time was reluctant to leave the sanctuary of reception. We were supposed to do a walk around every 2 hours when no one was in the building, every hour if there was, and I didn't want Stacey to look at any of the recordings in the morning to find I hadn't done my job. Peeling myself out of the chair, I went to the toilet, taking time to splash water on my face before returning to the desk, pocketing my phone, and making my way towards the stairs. It felt good to stretch my legs, and perhaps the climb up and down 3 floors, checking the stairwells as I went, would work up an appetite, although I doubted it. To the right, and closest to the counter, was the door to the east stairwell. Inside, its bright lights assaulted my eyes, not helped by the fact the steel staircase had been painted the same luminous yellow as the doors. That was the colour scheme for Storage Queen. Purple and yellow, even down to the cheesy crown logo that adorned the building glowing at night. The owners had been a little too keen with the yellow. It was everywhere, and so vivid it burnt my retinas. The only sound was the rubber soles of my trainers making the metal clang and echo with each step. When I reached the first floor, the porthole window in the door from the stairwell into the corridor was encased in darkness. Anyone could have been on the other side of it, waiting in the pitch black to jump out. But I knew it was just my overactive imagination, which played up every single night shift. I hoped by the time I'd worked here for 6 months, I would have rid my mind of the tricks it played on me. As I loitered, steeling myself to open the door, I heard a thud from above, reminding me I wasn't alone. It sounded like the visitor upstairs might have dropped something, and weirdly, it gave me a little bit of comfort, knowing if something happened during my checks, another human was on site to help. As always, almost as soon as I pulled the door open, the overhead light sprang on, illuminating the empty corridor. There were no monsters hiding in the shadows, and I breathed a silent sigh of relief, shaking my head at my foolishness. Time to get on with the job I'd been employed to do. A walk around wasn't rocket science. I moved along the corridor, checking left and right to ensure the unit doors were closed, opening ones without padlocks on that weren't currently being rented. We had to make sure no one was inside. Stacey told me she'd had to call the police on a poor homeless guy once who'd managed to sneak in during the day and found an empty unit to hunker down in. It was ingenious, really, somewhere dry and relatively warm compared to outside, especially in winter, but most of the units on this floor were rented, all with padlocks securing their secrets inside. Thankfully, I found no strangers lurking, as I was sure I wouldn't have been as calm as Stacy had I discovered someone hiding. Each floor was identical, long passages of bland grey with what seemed like a never-ending amount of acid yellow doors. It was easy to forget where you were, what corridor, on what floor, or even which stairwell if you got distracted. Once content all the doors on the floor were secure and the ones that weren't padlocked were empty, I came back on myself, double-checking, then climbed up the stairs towards the second floor to start the process again. Freezing mid-step when, from somewhere, an earth-shattering shriek filled the dark and empty steel cavern and stopped me in my tracks. Chapter 3. It only lasted a few seconds, but the shrill scream turned my veins to ice. I stood rigid in the stairwell, body trembling as I peered through the porthole into the darkness of the second floor, breath fogging up the glass. A chill ran up my spine as the air shifted around me, all at once becoming heavy and oppressive. Could it have been an animal? And if so, how had it got in? Or had I been mistaken? Was it another squeaky trolley wheel? No, I'd heard it, and it didn't sound like a trolley. It sounded human. I chewed the inside of my cheek. It couldn't have come from this floor, as no lights were on in the corridor, which meant no one was moving around. Unless it came from inside a unit. I stared back down the centre of the stairs, the light reflecting off the yellow metal, trying to be as quiet as a mouse, waiting for the sound to come again before I moved. But standing alone in the crushing silence made me jittery. What if someone or something was hurt? Trying to replay the sound in my head, I doubted myself. Could I be sure it was human? I debated where to go next. The acoustics were off in the warehouse due to the amount of steel. Noise seemed to bounce around, and you never quite knew exactly where it was coming from. What I did know was that up to a few minutes ago there was only one other person in the warehouse, and I didn't think the sound had come from him. The policy was, if in doubt, call security, but I didn't want to get in trouble for calling them if it was a false alarm. I eased the door open to the second floor, cringing at the squeak of the hinge and balling my hands into fists as the lights sprang on again, illuminating an empty corridor. Goosebumps ran the length of my arm as I waited for someone to appear. I couldn't see around the corner, so had to assume I was the only one up here. I'd been the one to set the lights off after all. Stepping back inside the stairwell, I paused to listen again, looking up and down to the neighbouring floors, but unable to hear anything besides my racing pulse going 10 to the dozen. I breathed in and out slowly. Part of me wanted to remain right where I was, call Stacy or Dom even, tell them I'd heard something, and I was scared. He'd come, wouldn't he? Despite our breakup, he'd show up if I needed him to. The thought of confronting whoever or whatever had made that sound filled me with dread, but what choice did I have? Eventually, common sense won, and with slow, measured footsteps, I made my way up to the third floor. Before I reached it, I could see the light from the corridor beaming through the porthole. Obviously, the lights were going to be on. The renter in the baseball cap was using his storage unit. As gingerly as before, I eased the door ajar and peeked around to see a unit open at the far end of the corridor just before the bend. My neck prickled, sending waves of electricity down my spine, my nervous system giving out the body's natural fight-or-flight response. Despite knowing the biological reason, it didn't make the situation any less intimidating. but someone could need my help, and that propelled me forwards. I reminded myself that I worked here. I was in charge, and whatever happened was my responsibility while I was on duty. But it didn't ease the dread that crawled up my back. That sound had spooked me. I tried to make my approach along the corridor as quiet as possible, stopping at a tiny red speck on the grey concrete walkway. My red Adidas gazelles just centimetres away were a perfect match in colour. The speck seemed to glimmer as the overhead lights bounced off it, and I bent down for a closer look, swallowing the lump that grew in my throat. Was it blood? Dabbing my finger into the speck, effectively wiping it away, I brought it up to my face, recoiling. Its metallic odour was barely noticeable, but I'd had enough sessions in laboratories working with vials of the stuff to know that what I was rubbing between my fingertips was blood.
Everything okay?
I jumped at the deep voice booming down the corridor, nearly losing my balance as I straightened up. I couldn't place the accent, Polish, maybe, or Czech. It sounded quite harsh and abrupt, but the man in the baseball cap standing at the far end of the corridor wore a perplexed smile. His arms were folded across his chest, and he resembled a bouncer at one of the many nightclubs Laura had dragged me to over the years, preparing to ask me for ID before he'd allow us in. He was no height at all, but stocky as hell, and not someone you'd want to pick a fight with. "Fine," I replied, my voice coming out a little high-pitched. "Just doing my checks." I pulled my face into an apologetic expression and tried to make my body appear relaxed as I walked towards him, but my shoulders remained rigid with tension. He stayed motionless as I approached, legs reluctant to move and feeling self-conscious, eyeing me curiously while I tried to work out if he was a threat. His red-rimmed eyes seemed to bore into me, and my resolve to remain calm withered away with the blood I'd rubbed between my fingers. Whose blood was it? Had it been here earlier, meaning Stacy missed it on her last check, or had it happened since I'd arrived on duty? The man pulled his black cap low as I closed the distance between us. Was he trying to conceal his face? Unsettled by our interaction, I suddenly remembered I should be checking the doors, and immediately swiveled my head from side to side as I passed each unit.
Checking they're locked?
He asked, his lip curling upwards. Was he mocking me or making conversation? It had been an effort for him to nod his head in greeting when he'd arrived. "Yep," I replied, my voice as light as silk, betraying my thudding pulse. He stepped aside at the last minute, moving out of my path, and despite being determined I wouldn't, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced inside the open door of his unit as I passed. To my surprise, it was empty except for the suitcase, which was closed and lying flat on the floor. I could sense his eyes on my back, burning into my t-shirt, but I tried to keep my pace steady, fighting the urge to take off and run out of sight around the corner to the west stairwell.
Have a great night,
he called as I reached the end to turn left, sounding insincere. "Thank you," I said over my shoulder, a quick glance revealing he was still standing there watching me go. I shuddered. Something about him gave me the creeps, but I forced myself to stop and turn around. "Did you hear a noise a few minutes ago? It sounded like a scream." He shrugged, mouth turned downwards, and shook his head.
Nope.
I nodded, unsure if I was convinced, but eager to put some distance between us. The noise had put me on edge, and I continued half-heartedly doing my checks around the rest of the third floor. Hopefully, he'd be finished doing whatever he was doing soon, and I'd have the warehouse to myself. I'd have to check the cameras to make sure no one had come in whilst I was doing my walk around, but if they hadn't, then maybe I'd be able to relax a little. Nothing was amiss on the rest of the third floor, and I quickly walked the second floor, having missed it on my way up, before heading back down to reception, intending to check the toilets and then do a little digging. I'd heard a yell or a scream. I was sure of it, trying to recall the sound. But already I was doubting myself. Was it a sound of pain or terror? The only thing remotely similar was foxes I'd heard over the woodland at the back of our house in the middle of the night. Whether they were mating or fighting, I didn't know, but the noise was horrific. I wanted to double-check I hadn't somehow missed anyone entering Storage Queen. When I reached my desk, the screensaver had kicked in. I logged on and scrolled back through the camera footage of the entrance from 5 o'clock, an hour before I'd arrived. 2 lots of renters had left before the couple I'd seen arrived in their van, collecting the trolley with the squeaky wheel and loading boxes onto it. I moved the feed forward. A VW Golf in battleship grey drove into the car park and sat for a while before driving out. I couldn't tell if the driver was the man in the baseball cap currently on the third floor, but the car looked to be the same. Had he forgotten something, or was he waiting for a better time to visit? A time when there were no other customers on site. The idea made me shudder, and I made a note of the registration number on my pad, underlining it twice because what he'd written in the visitor book was barely legible. I carried on watching right until Stacey left, hurrying to her flash BMW, and then the couple left in their van before the Golf returned. It was definitely the same vehicle, it had the same registration plate. I paused the footage and shrank the camera feed down on the desktop and clicked into the database where each unit had a name attached to it. Number 321 was rented by a Sasha Chismarova on a 6-month rolling contract, no registration plate listed. I opened the scanned copy of the agreement and saw it had been signed off by Stacey, and to date there were no overdue payments or notes on the account. I assumed Sasha was female, so who was the man up there now? Checking the visitor book again, I couldn't tell what name he'd put down either. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unsure whether to give Stacey a ring just to see if I was overreacting, but I'd already made her late home. I didn't want to disturb her evening further, not on a Friday night. She might already be in her pyjamas, half a bottle of wine down by now. I didn't even know if she had kids. I'd never thought to ask. I hadn't noticed if she wore a wedding ring, and had no idea about her world outside of Storage Queen. She hadn't volunteered anything about her personal life during our interactions. While I had my phone in my hand, I checked my notifications on autopilot. Disappointed to find no texts from Dom, no regret for the way we'd left things. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and the thought of him not being in my life anymore made my chest constrict. My blood sugar sat at 6.1, a safe range, no action required, so I turned my attention back to the computer screen, closing the recording and opening the camera feed for the third floor. I had so many unanswered